Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rob Eccles, and I'm Assistant Dean for Development at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation, The Life and Legacy of John R. Lewis. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. All attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. This event will be pretty conversational. So to submit your questions, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our very best to incorporate your questions into the conversation. And now for a quick introduction of your hosts for the evening. David Greenberg is Professor of History at Rutgers University and a fellow this year at the Leon Levy Center for Biography. He is writing a biography of the late congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis for Simon & Schuster. Dr. Greenberg is the author or editor of several books on American history and politics, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, Calvin Coolidge, and Alan Brinkley, A Life in History. Formerly acting editor of the New Republic and columnist for Slate, he now writes for Politico, among many other scholarly and popular publications. He holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a BA from Yale and lives with his family in Manhattan. Saladin Ambar is Associate Professor of Political Science and Senior Scholar at the Center on the American Governor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Dr. Ambar is the author of 4 books, including American Cicero, Mario Cuomo, and the Defense of American Liberalism. His forthcoming book, Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendship from Jefferson to Obama, is due out in 2021. Take it away, Professors Greenberg and Ambar, with The Life and Legacy of John R. Lewis.
Well, let me begin by thanking you, Rob, and thanking David for writing this book. I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I know from having assigned his other work to my students that it's going to be really, really powerful. So what we're going to do is have a conversation here and take your questions and into our conversation about the legendary life of John Lewis. So thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you, David, for hosting this and allowing me to take a look at your work. I thought I'd begin really in light of the introduction to you and your work by asking you, as someone who's worked, with presidential figures, Calvin Coolidge and Richard Nixon, and a wonderful book on the history of spin in the presidency. What was it that drew you to the life of John Lewis as a subject?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. And I want to thank you too for joining me tonight, and Rob and also Marina Costa for putting this all together. I'm glad to see we have a good sized audience. It's always on the webinars a little bit frustrating. We don't actually get to see your faces out there, but we can see that you're there. So I'll try to speak to all of you as well as to Dean. I had really focused in my earlier books on the presidency, but with an eye toward, what we sometimes call political culture more generally. So my books weren't just inside studies of what's going on in the White House, but a lot of how the presidents interact with the public, what presidents mean to the public, how presidents disseminate their ideas, their images, and so on. And my book on spin, Republic of Spin, which is really a history of the evolution of the White House spin machine, came out in 2016. And as a result, Donald Trump was not in it because I had finished it about a year before he even declared he was running for president. And it was this sort of strange phenomenon. I would go around to do book talks back when we had those, and the questions were always about Trump. And in the way it was helpful, I would use Trump to sort of help me think about the book and how could it explain Trump, did it? And so I was tempted as a next project to sort of extend this question of spin to Donald Trump and look at lying and deception, and at what point do we go beyond spin? But honestly, the thought of spending several more years with Donald Trump, more than I already had to in following the news, was just not an appealing prospect. And one day, I was watching a documentary about Robert Kennedy and saw John Lewis in it. John Lewis, I hadn't known this, or if I had known, I'd forgotten, worked on the short-lived Robert F. Kennedy presidential campaign of 1968. I thought, that's interesting. And it seemed to me that Lewis was increasingly appearing in various places in our culture. So again, to go back to the intersection of politics and culture, he was not just a political hero, but had become sort of this cultural icon. And I also felt, given the activism of the last several years, after George Floyd, we almost forget that this wave of activism about racial equality and inclusion really got started earlier in the decade. And I had felt that this was something that had always mattered to me, but I hadn't focused on in my books. It hadn't been a theme, or certainly not a prominent theme in my writing. And so a number of these factors together led me to think about John Lewis. And then I realized there was no biography of him. So that sort of became my purpose. Obviously, at the time I started, which was not all that long ago, but still, he had yet to announce or even know that he was ill. And so it was really only about 6 or 8 months into my project that he announced his illness. And then, it was not long after that, another 6, 7 months that he lived. And we had a few conversations in that time. I didn't get to know him or spend the time with him that I really wanted to. But it's interesting in writing about someone who's sort of right toward the end of his life, because you have both certain archival sources that historians typically use, but then you also have available to you interviews and the tools, say, of a journalist. And so I've done a whole lot of talking to friends, colleagues, family members, and so on. And that, too, is a set of sources I can draw on. Oh, you're muted now.
Forgive me. Well, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm hearing some feedback. I'm hoping it's not going to be a problem. But you mentioned this element of surprise and thinking about Lewis working on the 68 campaign of Bobby Kennedy. I was curious as to whether or not there were other elements, maybe one other thing that stood out to you that really surprised you when you began diving in headlong into his life. Was there something that you hadn't heard or known before that struck you as important?
And I continue to sort of discover a lot about his life, because in a very strange way, even though, in the last 10, maybe even 20 years of his life, he became this iconic figure. And, another thing that actually helped persuade me to do the book was I had described another book topic I was sort of starting to a friend, a non-academic. Her eyes kind of glazed over. But when I said, I'm thinking of a biography of John Lewis, her eyes lit up, and she said, he's kind of enjoying an RBG moment. And it's rather sad, poignant that they both have left us in the same short span of time. But both had assumed, I think, not identical, of course, but similar place in the popular imagination in the length of their careers. One thing that was really interesting to learn about John Lewis in his youth, when he first arrives in college in Nashville at a small Baptist seminary called American Baptist Theological Seminary, now American Baptist College, is just how sort of quickly he finds his way into this world of nascent activism, because it was so far removed from his upbringing. You know, he was born one of 10 children to tenant farmers who eventually managed to, his parents, buy a plot of land and have a farm of their own. But, you know, the kids all worked the farm. John Lewis took care of the chickens. That's a story he talked about a lot. His parents certainly weren't political, and sort of had the attitude, I think, of a lot of older African Americans in the South of that generation, which was, you know, hurting under the weight of segregation and Jim Crow, but not wanting to cause trouble. And, you know, his own motto, of course, toward the end of his life became good trouble, was very much in opposition to a lot of the messages that he got from his parents about stay out of trouble. He talks about how the first time he went to jail as part of a demonstration, you know, the thought of what his mother would think, because, you know, where he came from, going to jail is sort of the worst possible thing you could imagine telling your parents had happened to you. So part of what I'm trying to understand about the early life is what activated him so quickly and at such a young age to sort of throw himself in to this budding movement around Nashville, those early sit-ins, and there's something in him, a kind of spark that drew him to that, even though it wasn't what you would predict for a boy from the farm.
Right. Well, that too is really interesting to go back to those roots and to see how they play out later in life. I want to ask you about a little bit of a shift that takes place in the movement, one that Lewis himself doesn't participate in, and President Clinton alludes to this at Lewis's funeral in talking about Stokely Carmichael. And I read recently in looking at your work on this that, you know, Lewis attends Malcolm X's funeral. I think Malcolm X is assassinated on his birthday, which I thought was an interesting thing. He attends, and he has a real respect for Malcolm X. But unlike others in the movement, he never crosses the line and considers moving or abandoning, I should say, his nonviolent stance and his commitment to nonviolence. Could you talk about that? And what was it that kept him in that camp while others, including Carmichael and SNCC and others, decided that was no longer a position they could hold to?
Yeah, I think there are sort of two ideals that he learns very early on that stay with him. One is nonviolence, and the other is what Bayard Rustin and then Lewis come to call interracial democracy. And you know, we can talk about both, but they're sort of in alignment. The nonviolence he really learns from the Reverend James Lawson, who, if people watched Lewis's funeral, they know is still alive at age 91 or so and spoke at the funeral. And Lawson was a divinity school student at Vanderbilt. Lawson had met Martin Luther King just a few years before. They were the same age at Oberlin. And King said, "You get this. We need you in the South." And by "you get this," he meant he had studied Gandhi. He had studied the whole tradition of nonviolent protest that King very much believed in, that a handful of other civil rights leaders, James Farmer, not so well remembered today, Bayard Rustin to some degree, also shared this tradition. But it was not nearly as pervasive as we, in retrospect, sort of assume it to be. I think there was something about that tradition that merged with John Lewis's own Christian faith that sort of brought him to a kind of eureka moment, and he never really turned back. He always felt that this was the way. And he talks about how even as he would get beat up, even as he would be hauled off in the paddy wagons, he had a certain serenity, a certain confidence that this was the way forward. And I think the progress that he saw, between 1960 and those first sit-ins, and to digress for a moment, he also is in Nashville, which is one of the cities, perhaps the city, with the most successful sit-in movement that achieves integration of the lunch counters, the movie theaters, the department stores in all the South. In other cities, it's going to take until the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. But at the local level, these kids in Nashville get a hell of a lot accomplished in a very short period of time. So I think that also gives them confidence in their philosophy and their methods. And then the interracial piece of it is another one, that the idea of the beloved community, the idea of a common humanity, is one that's very deep for him. And because so many people he comes to work with sort of hand in glove in Nashville and then in SNCC are white, he can't go with Stokely Carmichael and others in SNCC who want to make it, eventually an all-Black organization. He argues, yes, it should remain Black-led and Black-directed, but he sees too many people who are too dear to him, like family, to feel that they could be somehow excommunicated or expelled from the movement. One of his friends, named Danny Lyon, who's a very accomplished photographer and filmmaker, he was John Lewis's roommate in SNCC, told me a story. He said it was sort of shortly before Carmichael takes over SNCC, and there was sort of the beginnings of a sort of flirtation with separatism, with Black nationalism. And there's a SNCC meeting, and then this other group is sort of meeting nearby. And they go into a church basement, and it's Danny and John and two other Black guys from SNCC. The other two sort of go on in, and the guy at the front desk points at Danny and says, he can't come in. And Danny, who's a photographer and has taken some of the iconic photographs of SNCC in those early years, sees his own photographs on the literature on the table there. He says, but those are my photographs. He's like, I'm on your side. The guy says, he can't come in. And John Lewis just pivots and walks right out. And Danny says, John Lewis understood what it was like to be turned away just because of your skin color. And he could understand at that moment something like what Danny Lyon felt, of course. And he was going to stand by his friend in that moment. And I think that says something very telling and profound about John Lewis and the ideals he carried. So even though, as you say, he actually had a lot of respect for Malcolm X, they happened to meet almost by coincidence on a trip to Africa when they each were taking a trip to Africa, and I think it was 1964. There were a lot of people in SNCC who were kind of more radical, who he also had a lot of respect for and learned from and debated with. But those sort of twin ideals always stayed with him. And for all the changes in his career, as he moves from protest to politics, I think they remain these kind of two guiding stars.
Thank you for that. And David, as I'm listening to you, I see our first question has come up, and outside of my own, and I have more. But let me ask from someone who's viewing this right now. And thank you for the question. It is not sure who to direct the question to, but I think it's you, David. Whether or not John Lewis's family is supporting this biography, are they cooperating in any way? Are they helping? What is their role, if any, in this project?
Well, the project's still in the early stages, so I haven't made a lot of inquiries yet to his family. Basically, I met with Congressman Lewis, it must have been February 2019, and got sort of his permission, his blessing. And also he has a longtime chief of staff, a guy named Michael Collins, who really is almost like a second son to John Lewis. Michael has been extremely helpful to me, and during the pandemic arranged some phone interviews. And Michael's given me, he's opened up his address book Rolodex. So I have the contact information. I'm kind of slowly, systematically working my way through of various interviews to do. So I'm not really talking to the family much yet, but in time. And he has, he was one of 10 siblings. I think 2 have passed away, but that leaves 7. And his son, his wife, Lillian, died a few years ago, but his son, John Miles, is still with us, lives in Atlanta. And he's got cousins. So there's a lot of family, I think, who can help shed some light on him as well.
David, a related question. Writing about someone who's just passed, certainly an iconic figure, but obviously someone with lots of family still around and people who revere him and have revered him. Do you feel any special or additional weight or pressure, angst even, in writing a biography of someone who is so beloved and so iconic, and obviously wanting to not get it right for history, but also wanting to do right by the family and so on, or is it just tunnel vision? I'm working on this and I'm treating this as I would maybe not Calvin Coolidge, but if you get my drift,
right? No, it's a very spot on question, and it is a challenge. I mean, for starters, it's a good thing. It's sort of reassuring to me that I've always had confidence that this would be, how could it not be, an admiring biography? I mean, given who John Lewis is and how he lived his life, I knew this. I wasn't going to go in to do a hatchet job. At the same time, it's you don't want to engage in hagiography. Although, it's been said if anyone is a saint in our times, you could argue that it's John Lewis, but still, everybody has their faults, their flaws, their enemies, their detractors. And I want to do justice as a historian to all of that, to show where John Lewis made mistakes, to show where he had regrets. And given that he is still a beloved figure to so many people, including his family and so many friends, there is a certain delicacy. And I think it sort of puts it to me as a historian to be sensitive. Now, that doesn't, that's not at odds with being honest and thorough. But they're a little bit in tension. So it is a challenge, I think, of writing about living figures, and especially writing about figures who you get to know and the people you interview. So there's a delicacy to it. I will say, we were talking a minute ago about Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis when he was kind of thrown out of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I mean, basically what happened was in 1966, he was running for another term as chairman. It was during really the height of the new consciousness about Black power. That term only like a couple of weeks later would sort of come into vogue. And Lewis is initially reelected. And then later in the evening at the same meeting, there's sort of a call to undo the election, which surely was not constitutional under SNCC's bylaws, but it happened anyway. And it leads in short order to John Lewis leaving the organization. Other people around this time are leaving SNCC. Julian Bond, his good friend, leaves around the same time. And when I first wrote an account of that evening and that episode, I wrote it very much sympathetic to John Lewis. And as I went back and read it and saw, how it read to me, I said, well, look, I may be more sympathetic to John Lewis's philosophy than I am to Carmichael, but I'm not really doing it justice if I don't actually include the voices here of Carmichael and of others who voted against him and of some of the younger, Lewis himself was still pretty young, but there were still people coming up who felt, John Lewis, he's too concerned with making nice with King, making nice with the White House. And they weren't necessarily wrong, or at least they had a good point. And so to be able to include the criticisms, the viewpoints of people who differed from him, I think makes it a richer portrait. John Lewis, was a great hero and leader of the movement, but he also, by 1966, was out of step with at least where SNCC was and where a lot of the younger generation was. Both of those things can be true at the same time. So I am trying to make this a human portrait, a portrait of a man with flaws and limitations, as well as the greatness that many of us have become familiar with.
Thank you for that. And I see someone is just giving a shout out to the CNN documentary, Good Trouble, as a wonderful a way, as we await your book, a way of getting in touch with the life and legacy of John Lewis. I want to ask you a kind of broad, sweeping historical question, and it's about that generation of civil rights activists and leaders that he was a part of, obviously, and a significant part of. And I'm thinking about those who remain, people like Jesse Jackson, Andy Young, Marion Wright Edelman. There are a few. It's sort of like a greatest generation that is diminishing with time. What was it about Lewis and his character, his qualities, personal qualities, that helped him or enabled him to grow over time? Not that those figures didn't, obviously they did, but what was it about him that kind of propelled him to this next career, this next level of greatness in American political history, if you will? What was it about him that may be distinctive? Perhaps one wouldn't have picked him out at that time.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think even perhaps 20 years ago, if you were to have drawn up a list of the leaders of the civil rights movement of the 60s, the most important 5 or 10, he might not have been on it. But by 2020, it seemed, of course, he should be on it. And I think one reason was this long congressional career he had. Now, of course, Jesse Jackson had a career in politics as a candidate without having held elective office. And there are other figures who went into politics too, Andy Young. But Andy Young has sort of been out of the limelight now for a long time. And it was this move, again, for protest of politics, which was the title of an article that Bayard Rustin wrote in the mid-1960s, right around the same time that Lewis is leaving SNCC. And it's a question, after these great achievements of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and other major accomplishments, where do the energies go? And John Lewis decided to put them into electoral politics. And so first you have the brief Robert Kennedy campaign. Then he leads something called the Voter Education Project, which highly relevant again today. It's basically an effort after the Voting Rights Act to get Blacks all across the South to register so that the votes will count and they will vote. And that is a really big undertaking. He leads that into the 1970s. Then he serves in the Carter administration and, finally in 1986 runs for Congress. So that story of deciding to channel these energies into elective politics, not completely unique, but I think is what gave him this second act. F. Scott Fitzgerald said there are no second acts in American life, but Lewis sort of refutes that. The first act, you could say, goes from 1960 to 66, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, Selma, all of that. And then there's a second act we know as the congressman. And that struck me as a really compelling story. I think also it's tied, you asked about his character, it's tied to his character because that persistence and that stamina is sort of so central to who he was. So the fact that, at age 80, he was still serving in Congress, when I talked to him about it and sort of trying to get a sense of when he might retire, I got the sense he wanted to continue at least until a Democrat was back in the White House and the Democrats were back in the majority, as they now are in the House, that he still wanted to get some things done. And that continual drive, I mean, it's almost like he willed his own importance by staying in the thick of things.
That's a great analysis, and it helps to put him in a broader historical context. Someone just asked, David, could you speak to his relations with the largely King coterie after the passing of Dr. King? What were those relationships like?
Yeah, I mean, it's one friend of mine who's a historian of civil rights and racial struggle suggested a book to me once called All King's Men, that you could sort of write a joint biography of how different folks, Andy Young, Jesse Jackson, and so on, Ralph Abernathy, how their different careers, evolved after 68. John Lewis, it was said to me that he was the one in the circle who King never really kidded or made fun of. That there's kind of this earnestness about John Lewis. I mean, he had a sense of humor too, but he first encounters Martin Luther King as I think he's 18, when he's in his first year at American Baptist in Nashville and is feeling kind of homesick and thinks he wants to attend Troy State, which is Troy, Alabama, close to home, but it's all white. And so he decides, I think I'll be the one to integrate it. And he writes a letter to King. After some effort, he gets through and goes to visit King. And he's there with Fred Gray, who was the lawyer on sort of King's movement. And I believe Abernathy's there as well. And they sort of talk this out. And King says, look, we'll do this for you. We'll help you with this, but we need your parents' approval, because he wasn't, I guess it was 21. He wasn't of age to do it without his guardian's approval. And King warned him, bad things can happen. They could be retaliated against, their friends, their neighbors. And when he goes back home to present this to his parents, they want to be supportive, but quite understandably, they're too fearful. And they worry about, their credit line getting cut off. They worry about violence. And John Lewis concludes the battle to integrate Troy State is not the one that he's going to wage. But he then goes back to Nashville and falls in with Jim Lawson. So there's a kind of history works, in funny ways. Anyways, not a direct answer, but he forged something of a relationship with King from a very young age, and really always looked up to him as a mentor, as an older brother / father figure. And I think he always saw himself as keeping alive King's ideals and King's mission, kind of through thick and through thin, through different political climates. Sometimes it was more fashionable, sometimes less fashionable. I think there probably was some sense of competition among the King legatees as to sort of who would carry the banner. Really, the one who there is the most sort of poignant story with is Julian Bond. I won't go on too much. I want to allow other questions and subjects, but just briefly, he and Julian Bond really become very good friends through SNCC. Then they both go to Atlanta in the 70s. Bond does a lot of work with him on the voter education project that I was just talking about. But in 1986, when a congressional seat opens up, both men want the seat, and neither one is going to stand down for the other. And it turns out to be a very ugly campaign, gets really negative, and sort of it's really kind of surprising to see John Lewis go negative. Basically, it was an open secret that Bond was using cocaine and having a lot of affairs. And it actually wasn't John Lewis who first brought it up. There was kind of a multi-person primary, and it was a different candidate who first brought up the drug issue. But then the two of them make it into a runoff, and in one of the debates, Lewis challenges Bond to a drug test. And some people feel this was really below the belt. The race kind of ruptures the Black community in Atlanta. And Lewis is really very much the underdog, but pulls off this upset victory, pulling together, again, an interracial coalition. He gets, I think, 40% of Black Atlanta support, but a much higher percentage of white Atlanta support. And it really did permanent damage to that very close relationship. Some people say they patch it up later, but others say it was never really the same again.
Well, in a way that steals the thunder from my next question, which is, you alluded to the idea that, John Lewis is one of our, recent American saints. But, saints are hard to write about, maybe not as interesting. And I was going to ask you, what did you find or perceive as his flaws or weaknesses, if any? Was there any, shadow side of interest in the life of John Lewis? And perhaps some of it comes out in this episode, but maybe there's something else that you would like to speak to that caught your attention as a historian.
Yeah, look, there's a lot. I mean, and when I bring up the negatives or and Lewis himself later said he regretted using the drug issue against his old friend. So when I bring these up, I want to stress that when you're seeing someone as fully human, these things have a way of not sort of denting their fundamental goodness or greatness. They actually make them more interesting and more human, and in some way more impressive. If they remain this idealized caricature where it's inconceivable that they would do anything nasty or selfish, then you're really not understanding them, and you're really not giving them their due. So I see it in that light. Another thing that's really interesting is in 1999, I believe it was, David Bonnier, who was the Democratic whip, the sort of number two in the leadership, stepped down to run for governor of Michigan. And there's a three-way race to succeed him, with the understanding that whoever wins is well-positioned eventually to become Speaker of the House. And the three-way race is Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and John Lewis. And all three formidable politicians. Interestingly, John Lewis is the first one to drop out of the race. He sort of tries. He has people over for dinners with Chinese food, and he's trying to sort of cultivate and do the job. But his staff is always telling him, you got to do more. You got to. And they would hear every day. Hoyer would announce he had this support, and Pelosi would announce she had that support. And they would say to Lewis, you got to work harder at this. Someone on his staff said to me, he thinks at some level John Lewis understood how he was destined to appear in the history books, and that maybe he was really sort of reluctant to become Speaker because it would sort of be gambling with a historical reputation that he had already achieved. I mean, what if he were to do it and not succeed? It would change the historical perception. Not that it was so cynical, but that I think there was a way in which John Lewis is someone who always actually understood his own limitations as well as his strengths. And one of the reasons he succeeded actually as much as he did was that self-awareness, which not all of us have. So he knew where he was needed and where to turn the ball over to someone else. You know, it's like being a good passer as well as a good scorer. He knew when to pass. And I think that served him really well, even though at times it maybe makes you feel like, oh, okay, so he wasn't really that good at this. He was, I mean, I as I sort of have dug into what he did sort of in various roles, like in the Carter administration, he led something called Action, which was a sort of Peace Corps, Vista, the volunteer organizations. Basically, he was a cheerleader. He really was never an administrator, but he found people to do those other pieces. And he would go around to different offices around the country and inspire people and get them motivated. He would inspire the staff in Washington when they were coming under congressional harassment about this expenditure, that. So it was still an important role, but it wasn't like he was doing everything. And he understood his limits, and he understood which roles were right for him.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. I want to introduce a question here, and it speaks to the fact that he lived through the early civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and was alive and still obviously active during the Black Lives Matter movement. And someone, Regina, asks, how would you compare or contrast the leadership of John Lewis with the leadership of Black Lives Matter? Take it away.
That's a difficult question. In some ways, because Black Lives Matter is still very diffuse. I find it hard to characterize. Now, obviously, there was great diversity and many strands within the civil rights movement of the 60s, too. And people forget SNCC was often at odds with SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization. And they both were sometimes at odds with the NAACP. So it was hardly a monolith then. But there's something about the very decentralized character of Black Lives Matter, which, began more as a slogan, and there is an organization, but it really doesn't speak for everyone who is out protesting or out doing racial justice activism. I think there probably one difference I would say is Lewis. I mean, it's funny. People often quote Lewis's March on Washington speech in 1963, where he's saying, let's not be patient, and it's kind of like a letter from the Birmingham jail style comment about enough with patience, enough telling us we can't wait, exactly what I'm thinking of. It's very much in that vein. And yet, I think he moves, when he enters politics, into a recognition or an appreciation. Some people might call it selling out, but I think he would say an appreciation of when patience is necessary, when taking the long view is necessary. And I think Lewis, very much admired the Black Lives Matter activists of today, but also wanted to impart to them a sense of the long view. Not that they should relent or desist or let up, but that you're not going to achieve everything overnight in one fell swoop. He also, I think, would be somewhat out of line or in opposition to what people now often talk about as Afro-pessimism. in his own lifetime, he just saw things change so much, and his own situation changed so much. Rising to be a congressman, the fall of explicit, de facto, de jure segregation in the South, that he always emphasized how much change did happen, how much could be achieved. And I think these days there's, I don't know if I would say this is Black Lives Matter, but certainly in a lot of intellectual thought, a view of the American past as too unchanging, that kind of a relentless story of, if not failure, of oppression that doesn't admit of the change and progress that's also been there. Some of this is a matter of time. I recently, right before the pandemic, traveled to Atlanta and to Alabama. And I went to a number of different civil rights museums and was struck by the difference in Birmingham, the Civil Rights Museum, which was done, I think maybe in the late 80s, early 90s. Even though a lot of it focuses on the Jim Crow period, there's a great focus on the culture and life that Black Americans made there. The church, the music, their businesses, their culture. And it's it's almost positive portrait in spite of it occurring in Jim Crow era. Then in Montgomery, I saw the newer museum, I'm forgetting the name, the one associated with Bryan Stevenson, which really traces the Black experience from the slave trade, through slavery, through Jim Crow, and then into mass incarceration. There's actually very little, it's a wonderfully impressive museum, but there's very little in there of positive aspects of Black Americans' experience. And both obviously are telling important stories, but from very different perspectives. And I think John Lewis sort of took more the former perspective. There is something positive and optimistic in him at the core that I think is, some people share it today, but it's not completely shared today.
On this note of optimism, I want to ask you about John Lewis's relationship with Barack Obama. That part of that so-called Joshua generation that comes after, and all of the progress and the losses that were suffered in that generation, born in 1961, from a distance, not having met either man or studied their relationship in any way other than just through the media. What can you make of their relationship? It seems from a distance to have been quite special.
I think it was very special. And I think Obama, it's an interesting story because Obama sort of didn't come out of the movement in the way Jesse Jackson did and others did. And as you probably know, and probably some of the audience remembers, initially John Lewis and a lot of Black leaders supported Hillary Clinton in the 2008 campaign. I interviewed Vernon Jordan, and he said, I told Barack Obama, he said, I'm too old to trade friendship for race, whatever that means exactly. John Lewis did at a certain point shift. And he said, and I don't know if I really should take this literally. He said this was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He said it was harder than being beaten at Selma. And he was asked, why? How can you say that? He said, well, because it involved these personal friendships. And I think he had gotten very close to both Bill and Hillary Clinton. And he felt pressure initially sort of from his district and from his constituents to kind of get on the Obama bandwagon. And I think he eventually did so, not so much because of that pressure, but because he saw history being made, and he felt it was his place to be with that history being made. And he does go on to forge a very special relationship with Obama. I think he never got the same personal closeness that he did with the Clintons, ironically. But there's a story that's now been told a few times. On the day of Obama's inauguration, Obama, the first person after he finishes his speech, as he's kind of stepping off the dais, that he goes over to and hugs is John Lewis. And I believe it's a program from the inauguration. He gives him that sign that says, "Because of you, John." And I think, Obama, in a way, it's difficult to say. I don't want to put it in a way that's inartful, but in a way, he sort of chose to align himself with that history. It became a theme in his speeches in 2008, probably as people remember. And it was almost as though for Obama, having John Lewis there made Obama appreciate even more the historic nature of his election, if that doesn't sound too strange. And I want to learn more about their personal relationship. I have lots of stories of Lewis going to the White House under Clinton and strategizing with Clinton about various things. Less so about Obama, but I think more there for me still.
Terrific.
Gentlemen, I'd just like to do a quick time check. It's 5:54, so we probably have time for one more question.
Perfect. Who was he close to? Were there women in his life, family members, or romantic interests that he could unburden himself to? He could share his stories with. You mentioned Collins earlier. Who are the people close to him, and what did those relationships mean to him? How did they play out and matter in his life?
Yeah, very interesting question. I mean, this is a bit, the romantic side of John Lewis is a bit of a black box. For all those years in the movement, he's a young guy in his 20s, and there's a lot of, dating, sleeping around, a lot of, it's the 60s. John Lewis isn't doing that too much, maybe a little bit here and there, but he always says, "I was married to the movement." And something both about a certain conservative traditionalism that came from his upbringing, combined with a somewhat shy personality. He was not the ladies' man. Then in 1968, 69, he meets Lillian Miles, who's she becomes a librarian from LA, but she's living in Atlanta, and they're married soon after. And she's really his closest confidant for the next, 40 some years. And she died in 2012. They adopted a son, John Miles. And so that relationship is obviously very important. And then, yes, Michael Collins, I think, was especially close to him. There have been other staffers. I mean, when he was ill, and then the pandemic comes, so, it's not like he can go out that much. It was Michael and sort of two or three other people. I know of one who was a former staffer who were just always over there, cooking dinner for him, taking care of him, making sure he had what he needed. And in some ways, he certainly wasn't a loner. But he didn't have, it's after Lillian died, there was, I think, a real void in his life. But he also, people say, had this great memory and sensitivity to friends. So, he might see someone after 30 years, recognize them immediately, bring up stories from their time together in the movement or what have you. And even some of the people who he kind of crossed swords with back in the, nonviolence versus Black Power days, years later would see him, then there would be this immense warmth. I mean, I went to a historical presentation by a guy named Charlie Cobb, who was in the movement, and who wrote a book even saying it was called something like "This Nonviolence Stuff Will Get Us Killed," and it was about defense of guns, for blacks to carry guns and stuff. And Charlie Cobb was talking about how too much of the history of the civil rights movement focused on a few great heroes, and we needed more about the rank and file. So afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "Well, after what you said, you might not want to hear this. I'm writing a biography of John Lewis." And his face lit up. He said, "Oh, he deserves it." No hard feelings, no bad feelings at all. Like, John Lewis just conjures up this great affection in people. So it's a little bit of a paradox, sort of a lot of warmth, a lot of affection, but maybe not that many he was really, really close with.
I don't believe we have time for any more. So I guess what I will do is just thank you, David. I've read your work. I know what an engaging writer you are, and I'm personally excited for this book. I know it's going to be terrific, and I'm looking forward to it. And I want to thank those who took the time to ask questions and put those up, and obviously those who contributed by just being here and listening. I know they've enjoyed it as much as I have. So I'll turn it back over to Rob. And
I'll just say my thanks as well. It's really been a pleasure to talk about and to field these very interesting questions. So thank you all.
Thank you both. Everyone, on behalf of Professor Greenberg and Professor Ambar and the Rutgers University Alumni Association, we thank you for joining us for this evening's presentation of the life and legacy of John R. Lewis. Please be on the lookout for David and Dean's upcoming books. For a full listing of future events and recordings of past events, please visit ouralumni.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.